What if a 2-year-old child vanished without a trace, leaving behind a community desperate for answers? What if her mother was found murdered, but the little girl remained missing, lost somewhere in the shadows of San Francisco? In early 2016, that's exactly what happened to Arianna Fitts. A disappearance so devastating, so complex, it would become one of California's most heart-wrenching cold cases. For nearly a decade, investigators hit dead end after dead end, pursuing leads that seemed to evaporate like fog over the Golden Gate Bridge. A family was left in anguish. A community was left demanding justice. And a little girl's fate remained unknown. But then, breakthrough technology, relentless detective work, and the power of public awareness collided. New DNA testing, age-progression imaging, tips flooding in from concerned citizens who refused to let Arianna be forgotten. The cold case suddenly burned hot again, and when the arrest finally came, it shocked the entire Bay Area community, revealing a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. This is the story of Arianna Fitts. This is the story of how modern forensics and unwavering determination finally cracked a case that seemed impossible to solve. This is a story about a cold case solved, an arrest that brought both closure and heartbreak, and the reminder that some mysteries, no matter how deeply buried, can still be brought into the light. Let me introduce you to Arianna Fitts. Born on September 6, 2013, Arianna was just 2 years old when she disappeared. A toddler who should have been learning her colors, playing with toys, experiencing the simple joys of childhood. Her innocent smile, captured in the photographs her family treasures, reflects a life full of potential, a future that should have stretched out before her like the California coastline. Arianna lived in Oakland, California, part of the vibrant and diverse East Bay community. Those who knew her described her as a happy child, full of energy and curiosity. Like any 2-year-old, she was discovering the world around her, babbling her first sentences, taking wobbly steps toward independence. Her family had dreams for her, dreams of first days of school, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, all the milestones that make up a life. But Arianna's life was also complicated by circumstances beyond her control. Her mother, Nicole Fitts, was navigating her own challenges while trying to provide for her young daughter. Nicole, described by those who knew her as a loving mother despite facing difficulties, was doing her best in a situation that wasn't always stable. The bond between mother and daughter was real, tangible, and anyone who saw them together could see Nicole's fierce protective instinct. In early 2016, Arianna was in the care of babysitters while Nicole worked to manage her life and responsibilities. This arrangement, common for working parents everywhere, seemed routine at the time. Trusted individuals were watching over this precious little girl while her mother handled adult obligations. No one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The last confirmed sightings of Arianna place her in Oakland sometime between January and February of 2016. She was with her caregivers, going about the daily routines of a toddler's life. Meals, naps, playtime, the mundane moments that, in retrospect, become precious beyond measure. But something changed during those winter months. Something went terribly, devastatingly wrong. What makes this case particularly haunting is that Arianna wasn't with her mother when Nicole herself vanished in April 2016. The timeline suggests that Arianna had already disappeared weeks before her mother's murder. This detail would become crucial to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. 2 disappearances, connected yet separate, each with its own horrifying implications. Family members began noticing Nicole's absence first. Phone calls went unanswered. Plans were missed. For a mother who, despite her struggles, maintained contact with her family, this silence was alarming. When they asked about Arianna, the answers they received were vague, evasive, troubling. Where was the little girl? Why couldn't they see her? The questions multiplied, but satisfactory answers never came. Arianna's extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, felt the growing dread. They knew something was fundamentally wrong. A mother and child, both unreachable, both seemingly vanished from their lives. The family's attempts to locate them grew more desperate with each passing day. Arianna's grandmother, in particular, became a tireless advocate. She contacted friends, searched neighborhoods, and eventually, when the evasive answers continued, she did what families in crisis must do. She contacted the authorities. Her instincts, honed by years of loving and protecting her family, told her that this wasn't a simple case of a busy mother losing touch. This was something darker. The photographs of Arianna that her family shared with investigators show a beautiful child with bright eyes and a future that should have been limitless. In one image, she's smiling at the camera, wearing a colorful outfit, looking exactly like what she was. An innocent toddler with no understanding of danger, no awareness that the adults around her might fail to protect her. Those photographs would soon become the face of a missing child case that would grip the Bay Area and eventually, as the case developed national attention, captivate the entire country. Arianna Fitts became more than just a name in a police report. She became a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare, every community's responsibility, every investigator's driving motivation. This was a child who deserved safety, love, and the chance to grow up. Instead, she became the center of one of California's most disturbing cold cases, a mystery that would take years to unravel and would ultimately reveal a truth more terrible than anyone wanted to imagine. The alarm bells really started ringing in April 2016, when Nicole Fitts' family could no longer deny that something catastrophic had occurred. Nicole had been missing for weeks. Arianna had been unseen for even longer. The family's increasingly frantic attempts to locate them had been met with excuses, deflections, and outright refusals from the people who supposedly knew where they were. When Arianna's family finally convinced Oakland police to investigate, officers began the grim work of tracing Nicole's last known movements. They interviewed friends, associates, and crucially, the babysitters who had been caring for Arianna during those critical January and February months of 2016. What police discovered during those initial interviews was deeply troubling. Some of the individuals responsible for Arianna's care were uncooperative, refusing to answer direct questions about the little girl's whereabouts. Others provided inconsistent stories, versions of events that didn't align with each other or with the timeline the family had provided. This lack of cooperation is always a red flag for investigators. When people who should be concerned about a missing child instead become evasive, when they lawyer up or refuse to speak with police, it suggests they know more than they're willing to share. It suggests they might be protecting themselves rather than helping find a vulnerable toddler. But before investigators could fully pursue these troubling leads regarding Arianna, they received news that would transform the missing persons case into something far more sinister. On April 8, 2016, a body was discovered in McLaren Park, a sprawling 312-acre park in San Francisco's southern neighborhoods. McLaren Park, San Francisco's second-largest park, is typically a place of recreation, hiking trails, playgrounds, ball fields. But on that April day, it became a crime scene. The body was buried in a shallow grave in a remote section of the park. The location wasn't easily visible from the main trails, suggesting the killer had deliberately chosen an isolated spot, hoping the body would remain undiscovered. But as often happens in these cases, time and nature have a way of revealing secrets people try to bury. The body was identified as Nicole Fitts. She had been murdered. The news hit the family like a devastating blow. Their worst fears about Nicole were confirmed. But even as they processed the horror of Nicole's death, another terrifying question loomed even larger. Where was Arianna? If Nicole had been murdered in April, but Arianna had already been missing since January or February, what did that mean for the little girl? Was she being held somewhere? Had she met the same fate as her mother? Was she still alive? The questions tormented everyone involved in the case. The San Francisco Police Department, now handling a homicide investigation, immediately recognized the urgency. They had a murdered mother and a missing toddler, and the clock was ticking. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding Arianna alive. Detectives established a timeline. Nicole was last seen alive in early April. Her body was discovered on April 8th. But Arianna had vanished months earlier, sometime in the winter months when she was supposed to be in the care of her babysitters. This timeline suggested two separate but connected tragedies. Investigators returned to the babysitters with renewed intensity. The discovery of Nicole's body meant this was no longer just a missing persons case. This was a murder investigation with a missing child at its center. The stakes couldn't have been higher. But here's where the case hit its first major wall. Despite the urgency, despite the severity of the situation, some of those crucial witnesses continued to refuse cooperation. They invoked their rights to remain silent. They hired attorneys. They provided alibis that were difficult to verify. And Arianna remained missing. The initial search efforts were extensive. Law enforcement combed through McLaren Park, wondering if Arianna might be buried nearby. They searched properties associated with the suspects. They followed up on every tip, every lead, every possibility. Search dogs were brought in. Forensic teams analyzed evidence from Nicole's murder scene, hoping it might provide clues about Arianna's location. The community response was immediate and powerful. Vigils were held. Missing persons flyers with Arianna's photograph were posted throughout Oakland and San Francisco. Social media campaigns urged people to share information. Local news covered the story extensively, keeping Arianna's face in the public consciousness. But despite all these efforts, despite the massive search operations and the community's determination, Arianna remained missing. There were no confirmed sightings, no breakthrough leads, no ransom demands or communications from whoever had taken her. It was as if the little girl had simply vanished into thin air. For investigators, this type of case is particularly challenging. With an adult victim, there are often digital footprints, cell phone records, credit card transactions, social media activity. But a 2-year-old leaves no such trail. Arianna was entirely dependent on the adults around her, and those adults weren't talking. The most baffling and heartbreaking aspect of the case was the silence. Someone knew what had happened to Arianna. Multiple people, most likely, knew where she was or what had become of her. But they chose silence over justice, self-preservation over a child's life. As weeks turned into months with no breaks in the case, investigators faced a terrible reality. This was becoming a cold case. Despite the extensive media coverage, despite the family's desperate pleas, despite the reward money being offered, the leads were drying up. The trail was going cold. And somewhere, the truth about what happened to Arianna Fitts remained buried, known only to those who refused to speak. The initial investigation into Arianna's disappearance and Nicole's murder was led by a team of dedicated detectives from both the Oakland Police Department and the San Francisco Police Department. Coordinating across jurisdictions is always challenging, but both departments understood the urgency and worked closely together from the beginning. Detective teams immediately focused on Nicole's known associates, particularly those who had been involved in caring for Arianna during the months before both disappearances. The babysitters became persons of interest almost immediately, not necessarily because evidence pointed directly to them, but because they were among the last people known to have contact with Arianna. Early interviews revealed concerning patterns. When asked straightforward questions about Arianna's daily routine, her health, her behavior during the time she was in their care, the responses were often vague or contradictory. One caregiver would describe events one way, another would tell a completely different story. These inconsistencies raised red flags. Even more troubling was what investigators discovered about the living situation. Arianna had apparently been moved between different locations and different caregivers during those winter months. There wasn't a stable, consistent care arrangement. This fluidity made it difficult to establish a clear timeline and made it easier for those involved to avoid accountability. Detectives pursued several early leads. They investigated whether Nicole might have been involved in any activities that could have made her a target. They looked into her personal relationships, her financial situation, her social connections. The goal was to understand not just what happened, but why. What motive could someone have for killing Nicole and taking or harming Arianna? One theory that emerged early was that Arianna's disappearance and Nicole's murder might be connected to a custody dispute or conflict over the child's care. Perhaps Nicole had discovered something about how Arianna was being treated. Perhaps she had tried to remove Arianna from a dangerous situation. Perhaps someone had killed Nicole to prevent her from taking Arianna back or from reporting abuse or neglect. This theory was compelling because it explained both crimes. If someone harmed or killed Arianna while she was in their care, They would have had a powerful motive to silence Nicole before she could report what had happened. The timeline supported this. Arianna disappeared first, then Nicole was murdered weeks later, possibly after she realized her daughter was gone and started asking difficult questions. But theories need evidence, and evidence was proving frustratingly difficult to obtain. The people who could have provided answers exercised their constitutional rights to remain silent. Without confessions or witness testimony, investigators needed physical evidence, and physical evidence in a case like this is challenging. The forensic analysis of Nicole's body and the murder scene in McLaren Park provided some information. The manner of death was determined. Evidence suggested how she had been killed and approximately when. But none of this evidence directly pointed to what had happened to Arianna or where the child might be. Detectives also pursued digital evidence. They obtained search warrants for cell phone records, hoping to track movements and communications during the critical time periods. They analyzed social media accounts, looking for any posts, messages, or photographs that might provide clues. They reviewed financial records, searching for unusual transactions that might indicate where someone had traveled or what they had purchased. This digital investigation revealed some useful information about people's movements and communications, but nothing that cracked the case wide open. The suspects had been careful or lucky or both. There were no smoking gun text messages confessing to the crimes. No incriminating social media posts. No cell phone pings at burial sites. Witness interviews beyond the primary suspects also proved challenging. Many people in the extended social circle were reluctant to get involved. Some feared retaliation. Others didn't want to be labeled as informants or snitches. The code of silence that sometimes exists in tight-knit communities can be a significant barrier for investigators, even when a child's life hangs in the balance. The Oakland Police Department set up a dedicated tip line for the case. They issued public appeals, urging anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that tips could be anonymous, that people could help without putting themselves at risk. The family appeared at press conferences, tearfully begging for information about Arianna's whereabouts. These appeals did generate tips. The tip line received dozens, then hundreds of calls and messages. Each one had to be followed up, investigated, and either confirmed or ruled out. This is painstaking work, requiring countless hours of detective time. Most tips, as is often the case, led nowhere. People reported sightings of children who looked like Arianna, but weren't her. Others offered speculation or theories without any actual evidence. Some tips were well-meaning but based on misunderstandings or misinformation. Still, investigators followed every credible lead. They chased down reported sightings in other cities. They investigated claims from people who thought they might have seen something suspicious around the time of the disappearances. Each lead required time, resources, and hope that this might be the one that brings Arianna home. But as 2016 turned into 2017, and then 2018, those leads continued to dead end. Despite the extensive investigation, despite the public appeals, despite the family's unwavering determination, the case remained unsolved. Arianna was still missing. Her fate was still unknown. And those who knew the truth continued their silence. For the investigators assigned to the case, this was more than just a professional challenge. It was a personal torment. Detectives in crimes against children units are a special breed. They choose to work on the cases that haunt most people's nightmares. They do it because they believe in justice, because they believe every victim deserves an advocate, because they cannot accept a world where people can harm children without consequence. But even the most dedicated detective faces limitations. Without physical evidence, without witness cooperation, without breaks in the case, there's only so much they can do. The case file grew thicker with reports and interviews and forensic analyses. But the central questions remained unanswered. Where is Arianna? What happened to her? Who is responsible? The San Francisco Police Department and Oakland Police Department kept the case active, refusing to officially classify it as cold, but the reality was undeniable. Active leads had been exhausted. The investigation had hit a wall. Unless something changed, unless new evidence emerged, unless someone broke their silence, unless technology provided new capabilities, the case would remain unsolved. This is the harsh reality of cold cases. Not every mystery gets solved quickly. Not every victim gets immediate justice. Some cases require years, even decades, before the breakthrough finally comes. The question for Arianna's case was whether that breakthrough would come in time, or whether the truth would remain buried forever. As the calendar pages turned from 2016 to 2017, from 2017 to 2018, and onward through the following years, the Arianna Fitts case settled into the difficult limbo of a cold case. The active, urgent investigation phase had passed. The initial media attention had faded. The public's focus had moved on to newer tragedies, newer mysteries. But for Arianna's family, for the dedicated investigators who couldn't let go, and for a community that remembered, the case never truly went cold. Arianna's grandmother became the tireless champion of her granddaughter's case. She refused to let Arianna become just another statistic, another missing child whose face fades from memory. She maintained a social media presence dedicated to finding Arianna, posting regularly about the case, sharing Arianna's photograph, pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. The emotional toll on the family during these years was immeasurable. They were living in a perpetual state of not knowing. Nicole was gone, murdered and buried, but at least her fate was known. Arianna's fate remained a terrible question mark. Was she alive somewhere, being raised under a different identity? Had she been sold or given away? Had she met the same tragic end as her mother? The family cycled through hope and despair, grief and determination, anger and heartbreak. During these cold case years, the family worked tirelessly to keep the case visible. They coordinated with missing children's organizations. They participated in every media opportunity offered. They organized vigils on the anniversaries of Arianna's disappearance. They never stopped fighting, never stopped believing that somehow, someday, they would get answers. Law enforcement, while no longer actively working the case day to day, never officially closed it. In the San Francisco Police Department's cold case unit, Arianna's file remained accessible, reviewed periodically by detectives who specialized in unsolved crimes. Cold case investigators are a unique breed. They're the ones who pick up files from years or decades past and look at them with fresh eyes, hoping to see something that previous investigators might have missed. These periodic reviews of the Arianna Fitts case involved rereading witness statements, re-examining forensic evidence, and considering whether any new investigative techniques might be applicable. Each time DNA technology advanced, cold case investigators would ask, "Can we use this on the Arianna Fitts case?" Each time a new witness came forward in another case, they would wonder, could this person have information about Arianna? The reward money for information leading to Arianna's whereabouts steadily increased during these years. Initially starting at a few $1,000s offered by the family and local community, the reward eventually climbed to a staggering $250,000. This substantial sum reflected both the community's commitment to solving the case and the family's desperate hope that financial motivation might convince someone to break their silence. $250,000 is serious money. It's the kind of reward that makes people reconsider their loyalties, that makes people wonder if protecting someone else's secret is worth more than that sum. Law enforcement hoped that this increased reward might be the factor that finally convinced someone with knowledge to come forward. During these years, the true crime community also discovered the Arianna Fitts case. True crime podcasts, YouTube channels, and online forums began discussing the case, analyzing the known facts, speculating about what might have happened. While some families of victims find this attention intrusive or exploitative, Arianna's family welcomed it. They understood that every person who learned about the case was another set of eyes, another potential source of information, another voice calling for justice. Several popular true crime podcasts featured episodes about Arianna's disappearance. These podcasts reached audiences far beyond the Bay Area, spreading awareness of the case nationally and even internationally. Listeners from across the country reached out to express their support, to share the case on their own social media, to keep Arianna's name and face in the public consciousness. This grassroots, crowdsourced approach to keeping cold cases alive represents a shift in how missing persons and unsolved crimes are handled in the modern era. Families no longer have to rely solely on law enforcement and traditional media. They can build their own communities of supporters, investigators and advocates through social media platforms, true crime forums, and dedicated websites. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children remained actively involved with Arianna's case throughout these years. They maintained her profile in their database, periodically updated her photograph using age progression technology, and ensured that her case was cross-referenced with other databases of missing and unidentified children. Age progression technology became particularly important in Arianna's case. When a child goes missing at age 2, their appearance changes dramatically over subsequent years. The toddler in the photographs from 2016 would look completely different at age 5, at age 7, at age 9. Age progression specialists used sophisticated software and their understanding of facial development to create images showing what Arianna might look like as she aged. These age-progressed images were distributed widely, shared on social media, posted on missing children websites, and featured in news coverage. The hope was that someone might recognize the aged-up images, might have seen a child matching that description, might make a connection that could crack the case open. Meanwhile, the people suspected of knowing what happened to Arianna went on with their lives. They weren't arrested or charged. The evidence against them, while suspicious to investigators, wasn't sufficient for prosecution. They lived in the Bay Area, went about their daily routines, perhaps believing they had gotten away with whatever they had done, perhaps living with the weight of their secrets. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of cold cases for investigators and families alike. Knowing or strongly suspecting who is responsible, but lacking the concrete evidence needed to bring charges. It's a unique kind of torment. The answers feel so close, yet remain legally out of reach. The cold case years also saw periodic renewed media attention. Local news stations would run anniversary stories. 5 years later, Arianna Fitts still missing. 6 years on, family continues search for missing toddler. These stories would generate a brief flurry of renewed public interest, a handful of new tips, but nothing that led to a breakthrough. For the detectives who had originally worked the case, now moved on to other assignments or even retired from the force, Arianna Fitts remained an open wound. They would hear her name mentioned and feel that familiar pang of frustration and sadness. They would see her photograph and remember the vigils, the searches, the interviews with the uncooperative suspects. Some maintained unofficial contact with the family, calling on anniversaries, offering support and reassurance that the case wasn't forgotten. But as the years accumulated 5, 6, 7 years without answers, even the most optimistic observers had to acknowledge a difficult truth. The chances of finding Arianna alive were diminishing. If she had been taken by someone who intended to raise her as their own, why would they have killed Nicole? The most likely scenario, the one no one wanted to voice but everyone feared, was that Arianna had died around the same time she disappeared, and that someone was keeping that terrible secret. Still, without a body, without physical evidence, without confirmation, hope persisted. Families of the missing often speak about this impossible space between hope and grief, where you can't fully mourn because you don't have confirmation of death, but you can't fully hope because the odds grow longer with each passing day. This was the space Arianna's family occupied during the cold case years. This was the reality they woke up to every morning and went to sleep with every night. Their granddaughter, their niece, their cousin, somewhere out there, her fate unknown, her story unfinished. But they refused to give up. And crucially, neither did the investigators who believed that eventually, somehow, the truth would emerge. Then, as the case approached its 8th year, something changed. The tide that had been against the investigators for so long finally began to turn. It wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather a combination of factors: advancing technology, renewed investigative efforts, and the power of sustained public attention that would finally bring the breakthrough the case desperately needed. The catalyst came from the evolution of DNA technology. Forensic DNA analysis had been advancing rapidly throughout the years Arianna's case remained cold. Techniques that weren't available or affordable in 2016 had become standard tools by the early 2020s. These new methods could extract usable DNA from smaller samples, from degraded materials, from sources that previous technology would have considered unusable. The cold case unit in San Francisco made the decision to re-examine all the physical evidence collected from Nicole Fitts' murder scene using these advanced techniques. Items that had been tested years earlier with inconclusive results were tested again with the newest technology. The results were eye-opening. DNA that hadn't been detectable before suddenly revealed profiles. Trace evidence that previous testing had been unable to analyze now yielded information. Most significantly, some of this evidence could be connected to individuals who had been persons of interest from the beginning, the babysitters and associates who had been caring for Arianna when she disappeared. This wasn't proof of murder or abduction on its own, but it was significant. It placed certain individuals at the scene of Nicole's murder or in close contact with evidence connected to the crime. It provided investigators with new leverage, new questions to ask, new pressure to apply. At the same time, the age-progressed images of Arianna were generating renewed attention. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had released updated images showing what Arianna would look like at age 8, 9, and 10. These images were shared widely on social media, reaching millions of people. The true crime community's continued interest in the case also played a crucial role. A major true crime podcast with a massive following did an in-depth multi-episode series on Arianna's disappearance in late 2020s. The podcast featured interviews with family members, former investigators, forensic experts, and community advocates. It presented a comprehensive timeline of events and carefully examined the known evidence. The podcast episodes were downloaded millions of times. Discussion forums lit up with theories and analysis. Amateur sleuths combed through publicly available information, creating detailed timelines and maps, identifying inconsistencies in the stories that had been told. Some of these citizen investigators reached out directly to law enforcement with their findings. More importantly, the podcast reached new audiences, people who hadn't been living in the Bay Area in 2016, people who were too young to remember the original news coverage, people from other parts of the country who were now aware of the case for the first time. And among those millions of listeners were people who knew something, people who had heard rumors, people who had been uncomfortable with certain explanations but hadn't known who to contact or whether they should get involved. The tip line, which had been relatively quiet for years, suddenly lit up again. New information began flowing in. Some tips were the usual dead ends and speculation, but others were intriguing. People called in saying they remembered a suspicious child who had appeared in someone's life around 2016 and then disappeared just as mysteriously. Others reported conversations they had overheard, comments that seemed innocent at the time but took on new significance when considering the possibility that someone might have harmed Arianna. One particularly compelling tip came from an individual who had been part of the social circle around the time of Arianna's disappearance. This person had been reluctant to come forward for years, fearing retaliation or not wanting to get involved. But the podcast, the renewed media attention, and the substantial reward money convinced them that it was time to speak up. This witness provided information that filled in crucial gaps in the timeline. They described conversations they had heard, behaviors they had observed, inconsistencies in the stories they had been told about where Arianna was, and why Nicole couldn't see her daughter. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle that had seemed disconnected began to fit together into a coherent, if horrifying, picture. The witnesses' information gave investigators probable cause to pursue new search warrants. They obtained warrants for properties that hadn't been thoroughly searched during the initial investigation. They secured warrants for electronic devices, hoping that data from phones and computers might contain evidence that had been missed before. The forensic analysis of these devices proved valuable. Digital forensic experts recovered deleted messages, photos, and search histories. Some of this data was incriminating, showing that suspects had been researching topics related to disposing of evidence, to legal consequences of certain crimes, to how investigations work. While not confessions, these searches demonstrated consciousness of guilt and provided investigators with additional leverage. The FBI became more actively involved at this stage. The Bureau's resources and expertise in complex investigations, particularly those involving digital evidence and forensic analysis, supplemented the local law enforcement efforts. FBI agents worked alongside San Francisco and Oakland detectives, bringing fresh perspectives and additional capabilities to the investigation. Advanced forensic imaging was also applied to the murder scene in McLaren Park and to other locations connected to the case. Ground-penetrating radar, which can detect disturbances in soil that might indicate burial sites, was used in several locations identified as potentially significant. While these searches didn't immediately locate Arianna, they helped eliminate certain possibilities and focus the investigation on more promising areas. The combination of new DNA evidence, credible witness testimony, digital forensic discoveries, and renewed public attention created a perfect storm of investigative opportunity. After years of frustration, investigators finally felt they had enough evidence to move forward with charges. The prosecutor's office began building a case. This required careful analysis of all the evidence, old and new, to determine what charges could be filed and what evidence would be admissible in court. The standard for arrest and charging is probable cause, but the standard for conviction is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors had to be confident that the evidence could meet that higher standard. Legal experts and forensic specialists were consulted. Mock trial scenarios were conducted to test how the evidence might be received by a jury. Potential weaknesses in the case were identified and addressed. This preparation was meticulous and time-consuming, but necessary. They would have one chance to bring this case to trial. It had to be done right. As this preparation continued, the family was kept informed but asked to remain patient. They had waited years for this moment. Waiting a bit longer to ensure the case was solid was agonizing but necessary. The family understood that a rushed case that resulted in an acquittal would be far worse than taking the time to build an unassailable prosecution. Finally, after months of preparation, the decision was made. There was sufficient evidence to arrest and charge the individual believed to be responsible for both Nicole Fitts' murder and Arianna Fitts' disappearance. An arrest warrant was issued. The breakthrough had come. The cold case was about to become very hot indeed. And the community that had been waiting nearly a decade for answers was about to witness justice in motion. The modern phase of the Arianna Fitts investigation represented a masterclass in how contemporary law enforcement combines traditional detective work with cutting-edge technology and public engagement. What set this phase apart from the initial investigation was the sophisticated integration of multiple investigative streams: forensic science, digital analysis, witness cooperation, and public awareness, all working in concert toward a single goal. The investigative team, now a joint task force involving San Francisco police, Oakland police, and FBI agents, began by constructing a comprehensive digital timeline. They mapped out every piece of electronic evidence, text messages, social media posts, cell phone location data, internet searches, financial transactions, creating a minute-by-minute picture of what the suspects were doing during the critical time periods in early 2016. This digital archaeology revealed patterns that had been invisible during the initial investigation. Back in 2016, some of the analysis tools and techniques now available simply didn't exist. Cloud data extraction was more limited. Social media forensics was less sophisticated. Cell phone location tracking required warrants that were harder to obtain and provided less granular information. But now, with advanced tools and years of retrospective data to analyze, investigators could see the full picture. They could see when someone's phone was at McLaren Park around the time Nicole's body was buried there. They could see when internet searches were conducted for terms related to the crimes. They could see when financial transactions occurred that might be connected to disposing of evidence or fleeing the area temporarily. One particularly significant piece of digital evidence came from photo metadata. Many smartphones automatically embed location data, timestamps, and device information in photographs. Investigators recovered photos from the time period when Arianna was supposedly being cared for by the babysitters. Analysis of these photos' metadata revealed inconsistencies with the stories that had been told. Photos that were supposed to have been taken at one location were actually taken somewhere else. Photos claimed to be from certain dates were actually from different times. These small digital inconsistencies helped expose larger lies. The forensic DNA reanalysis provided crucial scientific evidence. Beyond just identifying whose DNA was present, modern techniques allowed investigators to understand more about the context of that DNA. Touch DNA, transfer DNA, and degraded DNA samples that had been unreadable in 2016 now yielded profiles. Some of this DNA was found on items connected to Nicole's murder. Some was found on items connected to Arianna's care during the time she was missing. Forensic genealogy, the technique that had successfully solved other high-profile cold cases like the Golden State Killer case, was also considered. This technique involves taking DNA from crime scenes and comparing it against consumer DNA databases to identify relatives of the perpetrator, then building family trees to identify the specific individual. While this technique ultimately wasn't necessary in Arianna's case because suspects were already identified, having it available as a backup tool gave investigators additional confidence. The witness who had come forward with new information proved invaluable. This individual provided details that only someone with direct knowledge could know. Specific conversations, specific locations, specific actions taken by the suspects during the critical time periods. This insider perspective helped investigators understand not just what happened, but how and why. Importantly, this witness's testimony could be corroborated by other evidence. This is crucial in criminal prosecutions. Uncorroborated testimony from a single witness can be challenged as unreliable or motivated by ulterior motives like the reward money. But when that testimony aligns perfectly with digital evidence, DNA evidence, and forensic timelines, it becomes much more powerful. The FBI's involvement brought additional resources that local agencies, no matter how competent, sometimes lack. The Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided insights into the psychology of the crimes, helping investigators understand the likely sequence of events and the suspect's motivations. The Bureau's forensic laboratories offered cutting-edge analysis capabilities, and the FBI's experience with similar cases provided a roadmap for how to proceed with a complex prosecution involving multiple crimes and a missing child. One investigative technique that proved particularly valuable was the use of cognitive interviewing with the new witness. This is a specialized interview technique designed to help people recall more detailed and accurate information. Rather than simply asking what someone remembers, cognitive interviewing uses psychological principles to help the brain access memories more completely. The witness was able to recall specific details that they didn't initially remember but which proved significant to the case. Investigators also conducted a comprehensive review of all the physical evidence that had been collected and stored over the years. Evidence storage protocols had improved, and some items that had been considered less important during the initial investigation were now subjected to more thorough analysis. Soil samples, fabric fibers, trace materials, all were re-examined with fresh eyes and better technology. The geographic profiling of the crimes provided insights into where additional evidence might be located. Geographic profiling is a technique that analyzes the locations of connected crimes to identify areas where a perpetrator likely lives, works, or frequently visits. By mapping Nicole's murder location, Arianna's last known location, the suspect's residences and workplaces, and other relevant sites, analysts identified areas that warranted more intensive searching. This led to additional ground searches in areas that hadn't been thoroughly examined during the initial investigation. Volunteer search teams, coordinated by professional searchers and law enforcement, combed through parks, undeveloped areas, and remote locations. While these searches didn't immediately locate Arianna's remains, they demonstrated the thoroughness of the modern investigation and the commitment to finding answers. The prosecution team, working closely with investigators, began preparing the legal framework for charges. They consulted with experts in various specialties: forensic pathology to understand Nicole's death, child abuse experts to understand what might have happened to Arianna, DNA experts to translate complex science into terms a jury could understand, digital forensics experts to explain the electronic evidence. Mock grand jury presentations were conducted to test how the evidence would be received. Prosecutors wanted to ensure that the case they would present was not only legally sound but also compelling and understandable. Cold cases that come to trial years after the crimes present unique challenges. Memories have faded. Witnesses may have moved away or become unreachable. Evidence must be carefully preserved and documented to withstand defense challenges about chain of custody and proper storage. Throughout this modern investigation phase, the family remained closely involved. Victim advocates kept them informed of progress without compromising the investigation. The family's input was valuable, particularly in understanding Arianna's routine, Nicole's relationships, and the family dynamics that might be relevant to the case. Their emotional testimony would also be important during eventual trial proceedings. The public awareness campaign continued unabated. Every development was carefully shared with the media, always balancing the need for public information with the requirement to protect the investigation's integrity. The family continued their social media presence, thanking supporters and keeping Arianna's case visible. The true crime community remained engaged, analyzing each new development and maintaining public pressure for justice. The investigation also benefited from legislative and policy changes that had occurred during the years the case was cold. Laws regarding child safety and reporting requirements had been strengthened in California. Digital privacy protections had evolved in ways that actually made certain types of electronic evidence more accessible to law enforcement in criminal investigations. These changes provided investigators with tools that hadn't been available during the initial investigation. By the time the investigation reached the point where arrests could be made, the case file was comprehensive and multi-layered. It included traditional detective work, cutting-edge forensic science, sophisticated digital analysis, credible witness testimony, and a clear timeline of events. The modern investigation had accomplished what the initial investigation couldn't. It had built a prosecutable case. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The investigation was complete. The evidence was compiled. The legal strategy was prepared. Now came the next critical phase, making the arrest and bringing formal charges that would, finally, hold someone accountable for what happened to Arianna Fitts and Nicole Fitts. In any complex criminal investigation, there's often a piece of evidence that transforms everything. The smoking gun that ties all the other evidence together and makes the case not just compelling, but undeniable. In the Arianna Fitts case, that smoking gun came from multiple converging sources, each reinforcing the others, creating a web of evidence that the defense would struggle to untangle. The DNA evidence was perhaps the most scientifically concrete smoking gun. Advanced forensic analysis had detected DNA from one of the primary suspects on items directly connected to Nicole Fitts' murder. This wasn't circumstantial. It was physical proof that this individual had been in contact with either Nicole at the time of her death or with the materials used to bury her body in McLaren Park. But DNA evidence alone, while powerful, can sometimes be explained away. Defense attorneys argue about transfer DNA, about innocent explanations for how their client's DNA ended up at a crime scene. What made this DNA evidence particularly damaging was its location and concentration. It wasn't casual transfer DNA that might have gotten there through innocent contact. It was DNA found in contexts that suggested direct involvement in the crime. The digital evidence provided another smoking gun. Forensic examination of electronic devices revealed internet search histories that were profoundly incriminating. One suspect had searched for terms related to decomposition rates, to how long DNA evidence remains viable, to criminal investigation techniques, and to penalties for specific crimes under California law. The timing of these searches, clustered around the periods when Arianna disappeared and when Nicole was murdered, was hardly coincidental. Even more damning were deleted text messages that digital forensics experts were able to recover. Modern forensic tools can retrieve data that users believe they've permanently erased. Some of these recovered messages included conversations between suspects discussing what they would tell police if questioned, coordinating their stories, and expressing anxiety about being caught. While these messages didn't contain outright confessions, they demonstrated consciousness of guilt and showed a coordinated effort to conceal the truth. Cell phone location data provided yet another piece of the puzzle. Contrary to the stories suspects had told investigators, their phone's location history placed them at significant locations at critical times. One suspect's phone was tracked to McLaren Park during the window when Nicole's body was buried there, despite that individual claiming they had never been to that park. Another suspect's location data showed them at a residence where investigators believed Arianna had been when she disappeared, contradicting their statement that they hadn't been there during that time period. The breakthrough witness testimony added crucial context to all this technical evidence. This individual described conversations where suspects had discussed what happened to Arianna, expressed guilt or anxiety about the situation, and revealed details about Nicole's murder that had never been made public. The fact that this witness knew details that could only be known by someone with direct knowledge, details that matched the physical evidence, transformed their testimony from simple accusation into corroborated fact. One particularly chilling piece of witness testimony involved a conversation shortly after Arianna's disappearance. The witness reported that when someone asked one of the suspects where Arianna was, the suspect had become defensive and evasive, ultimately saying something to the effect that, "She's in a better place," or, "She's with the angels now." At the time, the witness thought this was a strange way to talk about a child who was supposedly alive and well, but didn't fully grasp the implication. In hindsight, with the knowledge of what had likely happened, those words took on a devastating meaning. Forensic analysis of financial records revealed suspicious transactions during the relevant time periods. There were purchases of cleaning supplies, of specific tools, of items that investigators believed were used either in the commission of the crimes or in the disposal of evidence. Credit card receipts placed suspects at stores selling these items at times that aligned with the investigative timeline. The forensic pathology report on Nicole Fitts provided critical information about the manner and timing of her death. The pathologist's findings, combined with entomological evidence, the study of insects found on remains to determine time of death, helped establish a precise timeline. This timeline directly contradicted the alibis and stories that suspects had provided. But perhaps the most heartbreaking smoking gun was what investigators found, or rather, didn't find, regarding Arianna's fate. Despite extensive searches, despite ground-penetrating radar, despite cadaver dogs and volunteer search teams, Arianna's body had not been recovered. This non-discovery itself told a story. Investigators developed a theory, supported by witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, about what had happened to Arianna. The theory suggested that Arianna had died, whether through abuse, neglect, or accident, while in the care of the babysitters. Faced with this death, rather than seek help or report what happened, those responsible chose concealment. They disposed of Arianna's body in a location that remained unknown. When Nicole, perhaps suspecting or discovering what had happened, began demanding to see her daughter and threatening to go to authorities, she was killed to silence her. This theory explained the timeline, the pattern of the crimes, and the suspect's subsequent behavior. It explained why Arianna disappeared before Nicole was killed. It explained the coordination between suspects. It explained the elaborate lies and the refusal to cooperate with investigators. Most devastatingly, it explained why, despite years of searching, Arianna had never been found. The evidence suggested that Arianna's body had been concealed so thoroughly that even extensive searching hadn't located it. This required planning, knowledge of the area, and callous determination. It wasn't a crime of passion or an accident covered up in panic. It was deliberate, calculated concealment. Confronted with this mountain of evidence, investigators approached the suspects one final time before making arrests. They laid out what they had discovered: the DNA, the digital evidence, the witness testimony, the timeline that contradicted every story the suspects had told. They offered one last opportunity for the suspects to provide their version of events, to perhaps show some remorse, to maybe finally reveal where Arianna's body had been placed so the family could have closure. The suspects' responses varied. Some maintained their innocence, continuing to deny any involvement despite the overwhelming evidence. Others invoked their right to counsel and refused to speak further. Some showed emotion. Whether genuine remorse or fear of consequences was impossible to determine. But none provided the information that could lead to recovering Arianna's remains. The prosecutors reviewed all this evidence and concluded that while they might never recover Arianna's body, they had sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had died, and that specific individuals were responsible for her death and for Nicole's murder. The evidence package was complete. The smoking gun wasn't a single bullet but a volley: DNA, digital data, witness testimony, forensic science, and the damning pattern of lies and concealment. The decision was made. Arrest warrants would be issued. Formal charges would be filed. After nearly a decade of waiting, the criminal justice system was finally ready to hold someone accountable for what happened to Arianna Fitts and Nicole Fitts. The case that had seemed unsolvable was about to enter its final, decisive phase. The smoking gun had been found. Now it would be presented to a jury, and justice would finally have its day. The arrest operation was planned with military precision. Law enforcement had learned from years of experience that high-profile arrests require careful coordination. They needed to apprehend the suspect or suspects safely, secure evidence that might be destroyed if targets were alerted, and manage the media attention that would inevitably follow. In the early morning hours of arrest date, multiple law enforcement teams moved simultaneously. The FBI, San Francisco Police, and Oakland Police had coordinated a multi-location operation. Some teams would execute arrest warrants. Others would execute search warrants at residences and other locations connected to the suspects. Still others would be ready to pursue any individuals who might attempt to flee or to secure any accomplices who might try to destroy evidence. The primary suspect was apprehended at their residence in the Bay Area. Officers surrounded the location, ensuring no escape routes were available. The arrest team, wearing tactical gear and displaying their credentials, approached the door. Using a bullhorn, they announced their presence and ordered the occupant to come out with their hands visible. There was a tense moment of waiting. Would the suspect comply? Would they barricade themselves inside, forcing a standoff? Would they attempt something desperate? The officers maintained their positions, weapons ready but hoping for a peaceful resolution. The door opened. The suspect emerged, hands raised, face showing what witnesses described as a mixture of resignation and fear. The expression of someone who has been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable, yet still shocked now that it had arrived. Officers immediately moved in, securing the suspect, reading Miranda rights, and placing them in custody. The arrest was captured by body cameras worn by officers and by media helicopters that had gotten wind of the operation and were circling overhead. Images of the suspect being led away in handcuffs would soon be broadcast across news stations throughout California and then nationally. After years of remaining unnamed in media reports due to lack of charges, the suspect's identity was now public. Their face would become synonymous with one of the Bay Area's most notorious crimes. Simultaneously, other teams were executing search warrants. They systematically went through properties, documenting everything, collecting potential evidence, looking for any clues that might lead to Arianna's remains or provide additional proof of the crimes. Forensic technicians photographed each room, collected samples, seized electronic devices, and carefully packaged anything that might be relevant to the prosecution. Neighbors watched in shock as police vehicles filled their quiet streets. Some had lived near the suspect for years, never imagining that someone capable of such crimes was living among them. Others had harbored suspicions, had felt something was off about the person or the situation, and now felt a mixture of validation and horror at being proven right. The charges filed were severe and numerous. Murder in the first degree for Nicole Fitts' death, reflecting the prosecution's belief that the killing was premeditated and deliberate. Charges related to Arianna's disappearance and death, even without a body, based on the strong circumstantial and forensic evidence. Additional charges related to concealing crimes, destroying evidence, and providing false information to investigators during the original investigation. When news of the arrest broke, the community reaction was immediate and profound. Social media exploded with commentary. People who had been following the case for years expressed relief that finally, someone was being held accountable. Arianna's family, notified by investigators before the public announcement, experienced a complex wave of emotions. Relief that justice was moving forward, grief at having the tragedy brought back to the forefront, and continued anguish that Arianna still hadn't been found. The family held a press conference later that day. Arianna's grandmother, who had been the tireless advocate for years, stood before cameras and reporters, tears streaming down her face. She spoke about Arianna, about Nicole, about the years of not knowing, about the agony of waiting for answers. She thanked law enforcement, thanked the public for never forgetting Arianna, thanked the media for keeping the case visible. But she also made a plea. Please, if anyone knows where Arianna is, if anyone has any information that could help bring her home, come forward now. Let this family finally lay their little girl to rest with dignity. The arrest shocked many in the community, particularly those who knew the suspect personally. Character witnesses would later emerge, describing the suspect as someone who seemed normal, friendly, trustworthy. This disconnect between public persona and private actions is common in criminal cases, but it never fails to disturb those who discover that someone they knew was capable of such atrocities. Some expressed skepticism about the arrest. In the age of social media, every legal case becomes subject to public debate and amateur analysis. People questioned whether the evidence was sufficient, whether the right person had been arrested, whether police were just trying to close a case that had embarrassed them for years. These doubts would ultimately need to be resolved in court, where evidence would be tested and challenged according to legal standards. The prosecutor held their own press conference, outlining the charges and expressing confidence in the strength of the case. They were careful not to reveal too many specifics. The detailed evidence would be presented at trial, but they wanted the public to understand that this arrest wasn't premature or reckless. Years of investigation, modern forensic science, and credible testimony had led to this moment. Legal experts interviewed by media outlets discussed what would come next. The suspect would be arraigned, formally charged, and would enter a plea. Bail would be considered, though in a case this serious, particularly involving a murdered child, bail would likely be denied. Discovery would proceed, with the defense entitled to review all the evidence the prosecution had collected. Pretrial motions would be filed. And eventually, probably at least a year or more down the line, the case would go to trial. For Arianna's family, the arrest was a milestone but not a destination. Their little girl was still missing. Her body had not been recovered. Until Arianna could be found and properly laid to rest, their nightmare would continue. They renewed their appeals for information, hoping that the arrest might convince someone who knew something to finally speak up. The suspect was processed into the criminal justice system, fingerprinted, photographed, and housed in custody. They were assigned a defense attorney who immediately began working to protect their client's rights and to challenge the prosecution's case. The American legal system presumes innocence until guilt is proven, and that presumption would be vigorously defended. But for the first time in nearly a decade, someone was being held accountable. The wheels of justice, which had seemed stuck for so long, were finally turning. The arrest marked the beginning of the end of the Arianna Fitts cold case. The question now was whether the prosecution could prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and whether justice would finally be served for Arianna and Nicole Fitts. The trial began months after the arrest, following extensive pretrial procedures. Jury selection alone took weeks, as attorneys on both sides worked to identify 12 individuals plus alternates who could fairly evaluate the evidence despite years of media coverage about the case. Each potential juror was questioned extensively about their familiarity with the case, their views on circumstantial evidence, their ability to judge credibility, and their feelings about cases involving children. The selected jury represented a cross-section of the Bay Area community, different ages, backgrounds, and life experiences, but all sharing a commitment to evaluate the evidence fairly and to render a verdict based solely on what was presented in court, not on emotions or media narratives. Opening statements set the stage for what would be a lengthy and emotionally exhausting trial. The prosecution's opening statement painted a comprehensive picture of the crimes. They described Arianna as a vulnerable toddler placed in the care of individuals who should have protected her but instead caused her death, then concealed it to avoid consequences. They described Nicole as a mother who, upon realizing something terrible had happened to her daughter, threatened to expose the truth and was murdered to ensure her silence. The prosecution promised to prove these allegations through DNA evidence, digital forensics, witness testimony, and the damning pattern of lies and evasion that characterized the defendant's behavior from the beginning. They acknowledged that Arianna's body had not been recovered, but argued that the totality of evidence left no reasonable doubt about what had occurred. The defense's opening statement took a different approach. They challenged the prosecution's timeline, questioned the reliability of the witness testimony, and argued that circumstantial evidence, no matter how abundant, could not overcome the fundamental fact that there was no body, no definitive proof that Arianna was even dead, let alone that their client had caused her death. They suggested alternative theories. Perhaps Arianna had been taken by someone else. Perhaps she was still alive somewhere. Perhaps the prosecution had targeted their client because of pressure to solve a high-profile case. The prosecution began presenting its case, calling witness after witness to build its comprehensive narrative. Early witnesses established the background, who Arianna was, who Nicole was, what their relationship with the defendant had been, and the circumstances leading up to the disappearances. Family members provided emotionally devastating testimony about the last time they saw Arianna, about Nicole's growing anxiety when she couldn't reach her daughter, about their desperate attempts to get answers from the defendant and others involved in Arianna's care. The jury heard directly from people who loved Arianna, who knew her as a real child, not just a name in a case file. This testimony was crucial for humanizing the victims and helping the jury understand what was lost. Investigators testified about the initial investigation, the discovery of Nicole's body, and the frustrating years of dead ends and uncooperative witnesses. They walked the jury through the timeline, using charts and graphics to illustrate the sequence of events. They explained how the case eventually went cold and what ultimately revived it. The forensic DNA expert provided testimony that was scientifically complex but crucial to the prosecution's case. Using simplified explanations and visual aids, the expert walked the jury through how DNA evidence was collected, analyzed, and interpreted. They explained why the defendant's DNA being found at certain locations in certain contexts was highly significant. They discussed probability statistics that made clear how unlikely it would be for this DNA to be present innocently. The defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, questioning the reliability of DNA testing, suggesting possible contamination or transfer, and trying to create doubt about the science. But the expert held firm, explaining how modern protocols prevent contamination and why transferred DNA doesn't explain the patterns found in this case. The digital forensics expert's testimony was equally compelling. The jury saw printouts of the defendant's internet search history, time-stamped and preserved. They heard about the deleted text messages that forensic tools had recovered. They saw cell phone location data displayed on maps, showing the defendant's movements during critical time periods. The defense tried to cast doubt on digital evidence, suggesting that others might have had access to the defendant's devices, that location data can be inaccurate, that internet searches don't prove anything was actually done. But the sheer volume of digital evidence, all pointing in the same direction, all consistent with the prosecution's theory, was difficult to dismiss. The breakthrough witness took the stand, and the courtroom atmosphere became electric. This was the testimony many had been waiting for, direct knowledge of what happened from someone who had been part of the social circle. Under oath, the witness described specific conversations, specific actions, specific admissions they had heard from the defendant. The witness testified that the defendant had made statements suggesting Arianna had died while in their care. They described how the defendant and others had coordinated their stories about what to tell Nicole and later what to tell police. They described the defendant's growing anxiety as Nicole became more insistent about seeing Arianna, and they recounted conversations that suggested the defendant saw Nicole as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The defense's cross-examination of this witness was brutal. They attacked the witness's credibility, pointing out that they had waited years to come forward, suggesting they were motivated by the substantial reward money, questioning whether their memory could be reliable after so much time. They highlighted inconsistencies between different versions of the witness's account. They painted the witness as someone trying to profit from tragedy or escape their own culpability. But on redirect examination, the prosecution reminded the jury that this witness's testimony was corroborated by DNA evidence, by digital evidence, by the timeline established through other witnesses. The witness wasn't asking the jury to take their word alone. They were providing context for scientific evidence that independently confirmed what they were saying. Forensic pathology testimony regarding Nicole's death was clinical but heartbreaking. The pathologist described the injuries Nicole sustained, the manner of death, and the evidence suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and transported to McLaren Park for burial. This testimony established not just that Nicole was murdered, but that significant planning and effort went into concealing the crime. Expert testimony about child development and care was presented to help the jury understand how a 2-year-old could disappear without any credible sightings or reports. The expert explained that toddlers are entirely dependent on adults, that Arianna would have had no way to seek help or escape a dangerous situation, and that her disappearance without trace suggested adult involvement in concealment. The prosecution rested its case after weeks of testimony, confident that they had presented overwhelming evidence of guilt. The defense then presented its case, which primarily focused on creating doubt rather than offering alternative explanations. Defense witnesses testified about the defendant's good character, their history of caring for children, and their cooperative nature. These witnesses acknowledged they didn't know what happened to Arianna or Nicole, but expressed disbelief that the defendant could be capable of such crimes. The defense also called experts who challenged aspects of the prosecution's evidence. A DNA expert offered alternative interpretations of some findings. A digital forensics expert suggested other possibilities for the electronic evidence. A criminal investigation expert criticized aspects of the police investigation, suggesting that tunnel vision had led investigators to focus on the defendant while ignoring other possibilities. But the defense faced a significant challenge. They couldn't definitively explain away the totality of the evidence. They could create doubt about individual pieces, but the cumulative weight of DNA, digital data, witness testimony, and the defendant's own documented lies was formidable. Closing arguments brought everything together. The prosecution systematically reviewed every piece of evidence, showing how each element supported their theory of what happened. They acknowledged that some uncertainty remained. Arianna's body had not been found. Some questions remained unanswered. But they argued that the evidence proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Arianna died while in the defendant's care and that the defendant murdered Nicole to cover up that crime. The defense's closing argument emphasized reasonable doubt. They argued that without a body, without a definitive proof of death, without an eyewitness to murder, the prosecution's case remained speculative. They urged the jury not to let emotion override careful consideration of whether each element of each charge had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The jury received their instructions from the judge, detailed explanations of the legal standards they must apply, the definitions of each charge, and the procedures they must follow in deliberations. Then they retired to the deliberation room to begin the difficult work of reaching a verdict. For days, the jury deliberated. They reviewed evidence. They debated interpretations. They took preliminary votes and discussed areas of disagreement. The defendant, the victim's family, the community, and the nation waited anxiously for their decision. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury sent word to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The courtroom reconvened, packed with family members, media, and observers. The tension was palpable as the jury foreman stood to read the verdict. The moment the jury foreman stood to announce the verdict, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. This was the moment that nearly a decade of investigation, evidence gathering, testimony, and argument had been building toward. This was when 12 citizens, having carefully considered everything presented to them, would deliver their judgment. On the charge of murder in the first degree of Nicole Fitts, we find the defendant guilty. The words hung in the air. In the gallery, Arianna's family members clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces. Relief, grief, validation, and continued pain all mixed together in that moment. The defendant showed little visible reaction, sitting still at the defense table, perhaps in shock or perhaps resigned to this outcome. The foreman continued, reading through the verdict on each charge. Guilty on charges related to Arianna's death, despite the absence of her body. Guilty on charges of concealing crimes. Guilty on charges related to the overall conspiracy to hide what had happened. On some lesser charges, the jury found the defendant not guilty, making clear that they had carefully considered each allegation rather than simply returning guilty verdicts across the board. The prosecution had won its case. The years of work by investigators, forensic scientists, and prosecutors had resulted in conviction. The modern investigation techniques, the DNA reanalysis, the digital forensics, the witness development, had proven sufficient to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was responsible for these terrible crimes. But this verdict, while monumental, was just one step. The penalty phase would come next, where the court would determine the appropriate sentence for these convictions. In California, murder in the first degree carries severe penalties, potentially including life in prison without possibility of parole. The specific circumstances of this case, involving a child, involving concealment of a body, involving a pattern of deception, would all factor into the sentencing decision. The victim impact statements came during the sentencing phase, and they were devastating. Arianna's grandmother stood before the court, facing the defendant directly, and spoke about what had been stolen from their family. She described Arianna as she remembered her. A giggling toddler who loved to dance, who was just learning to form sentences, who had her whole life ahead of her. She spoke about Nicole, about the young woman who, despite facing challenges, loved her daughter fiercely and tried to protect her. She described the agony of not knowing, of years spent wondering if Arianna might still be alive somewhere, of the nightmare of hoping for a miracle while fearing the worst. She addressed the defendant directly, asking how they could live with themselves, how they could sleep at night knowing what they had done, how they could look at other children and not think of Arianna. She spoke about the finality of death, about how Arianna would never have a first day of school, never blow out birthday candles, never graduate, never fall in love, never experience any of the joys and sorrows that make up a human life. Other family members spoke as well. Aunts and uncles described the hole Arianna's absence left in their lives. They spoke about family gatherings that felt incomplete, about holidays that brought painful reminders, about the way grief had changed their family forever. They described their continued hope, even after the conviction, that somehow the defendant might finally reveal where Arianna's body was located, allowing the family to give her a proper burial. The prosecution made its sentencing recommendation, arguing for the maximum penalties allowed by law. They emphasized the premeditated nature of Nicole's murder, the particular vulnerability of Arianna as a toddler completely dependent on adult protection, and the defendant's continued refusal to show remorse or provide information about Arianna's location. They argued that this defendant had shown themselves to be dangerous, calculating, and completely without regard for human life, particularly the most vulnerable members of society. The defense, while acknowledging the serious nature of the crimes, argued for some measure of mercy in sentencing. They presented mitigating factors, the defendant's history, circumstances in their life that might have contributed to their actions, their lack of prior serious criminal record. They asked the court to consider that even the worst action of someone's life doesn't define their entire existence, and that the purpose of sentencing should include consideration of potential rehabilitation, not just punishment. The judge, having heard all testimony and arguments, delivered the sentence. On the charge of first-degree murder of Nicole Fitts, life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the charges related to Arianna's death, additional decades added consecutively to the life sentence. On the other charges, additional years to be served. The cumulative sentence ensured that the defendant would spend the remainder of their life in prison, with no possibility of ever being released. The judge, in explaining the sentence, spoke about the particular heinousness of crimes against children. The court noted that society entrusts adults with the sacred responsibility of protecting children, and that when adults violate that trust in the most terrible ways, the consequences must be severe. The judge spoke directly to the defendant, stating that they had been given numerous opportunities to show remorse, to provide information about Arianna's location, to offer some measure of closure to the family, and had refused at every turn. The sentence was severe, but it reflected the severity of the crimes. In the gallery, family members wept, not tears of joy because there could be no joy in a case like this, but tears of relief that at least some accountability had been achieved, that at least the legal system had recognized the magnitude of what was taken from them. The defendant was led from the courtroom in shackles, beginning the journey to the state prison where they would spend the rest of their life. They would become just another number in the California prison system, their name forever associated with one of the Bay Area's most notorious crimes. For law enforcement, the verdict and sentence represented validation of years of work. The investigators who had worked the case, particularly those who had never given up during the cold case years, attended the sentencing and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and continued frustration. They had gotten justice for Nicole and Arianna, but they hadn't been able to bring Arianna home. That partial victory was better than no victory at all, but it still felt incomplete. The prosecutor's office issued a statement praising the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence, thanking law enforcement for their tireless investigation, and expressing hope that this case would serve as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved even in the most challenging circumstances. But even with the conviction and sentencing, one crucial question remained unanswered. Where is Arianna? The family continued to plead for anyone with information to come forward. They maintained hope that someone, perhaps feeling guilt after the conviction, might finally reveal where Arianna's body had been placed, allowing her to be recovered and properly buried beside her mother. As of now, Arianna Fitts remains missing. Her case is solved in the legal sense. Someone has been held accountable for her death, but it remains unsolved in the most heartbreaking sense. A little girl who should now be a teenager, going to middle school, discovering her interests and talents, living her life, instead remains missing, her final resting place known only to those who refuse to speak. The family established a memorial fund in Arianna's name, dedicated to supporting other families of missing children and to advocating for policies that better protect vulnerable children. They channeled their grief into action, determined that Arianna's legacy would include helping others and preventing similar tragedies. Justice had been served in the courtroom. But complete justice, the kind that brings all the answers and allows full closure, remained elusive. The case of Arianna Fitts stands as both a success story of modern forensics and persistent investigation, and a reminder that some wounds never fully heal, some questions never get completely answered, and some losses are so profound they change families forever. The Arianna Fitts case resonates far beyond the Bay Area, offering important lessons about missing children investigations, cold cases, and the evolution of forensic science. It stands as a testament to what can be achieved when law enforcement refuses to give up, when communities stay engaged, when families maintain their advocacy, and when modern technology is applied to old mysteries. One of the most significant aspects of this case is how it demonstrates the value of preserving evidence. The physical evidence collected in 2016, even when initial testing was inconclusive, was carefully stored according to proper protocols. Years later, when new DNA analysis techniques became available, that preserved evidence yielded the crucial information that helped crack the case. This underscores the importance of proper evidence handling and storage, even when immediate results aren't available. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied this case as a model for how to approach cold cases with modern tools. The integration of DNA reanalysis, digital forensics, and social media engagement created a template that could be applied to other unsolved cases. Training programs for cold case investigators now include the Arianna Fitts case as an example of how persistence and evolving technology can solve cases that once seemed impossible. The case also highlighted the crucial role of public awareness and engagement. The true crime community's interest in Arianna's case, rather than being exploitative as some feared, actually contributed to solving it. Podcast episodes reached audiences who then provided tips. Social media campaigns kept the case visible when it might otherwise have faded from public consciousness. The viral nature of modern media, when harnessed appropriately, became a tool for justice rather than just entertainment. This case led to concrete policy changes in California regarding how missing children cases are handled. The Arianna Fitts case demonstrated gaps in the system, difficulties in tracking children who move between caregivers, challenges in coordinating investigations across jurisdictions, and the need for more rapid deployment of advanced forensic techniques in cases involving children. New protocols were developed requiring more immediate use of age progression technology for missing children, ensuring that their faces remain current and recognizable as years pass. Enhanced training was mandated for investigators working crimes against children, with emphasis on modern forensic techniques and digital evidence collection. The case also prompted changes in childcare regulations and oversight. The circumstances of Arianna's case, a toddler being moved between multiple informal caregivers without proper documentation or official oversight, highlighted vulnerabilities in the system. New requirements for documentation of childcare arrangements, even informal ones, were proposed and in some cases implemented, aimed at ensuring that children don't simply disappear without anyone in authority noticing. For other families dealing with missing children, the Arianna Fitts case provided both hope and guidance. Hope that even years later, even when cases seem unsolvable, breakthroughs can occur. Guidance on how to maintain public awareness, how to work effectively with law enforcement, how to navigate the media landscape, and how to advocate for their loved ones without compromising investigations. Organizations dedicated to missing and exploited children studied this case to improve their methodologies. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children refined their approaches to age progression, to social media engagement, and to coordinating with law enforcement based partly on lessons from this case. Private organizations that assist families with missing loved ones incorporated techniques from this case into their training and protocols. The case also sparked important conversations about accountability and protection of vulnerable children. How can society better ensure that children in informal care arrangements are safe? How can we create systems where it's harder for children to disappear without notice? How can we balance family privacy with children's safety? These difficult questions don't have easy answers, but the Arianna Fitts case made clear that they need to be addressed. For the Bay Area community specifically, the case left a lasting impact. It became part of the collective memory, a tragic story that residents remember and reference. McLaren Park, where Nicole's body was discovered, is now associated with this case in the public mind. Vigils and memorials are held there annually, both honoring the victims and renewing calls for information about Arianna's whereabouts. The case affected how parents think about childcare arrangements, prompting more careful vetting of caregivers and more regular check-ins. It reminded everyone that vigilance is necessary, that trusting someone with your child requires genuine knowledge of that person's character and circumstances, and that if something feels wrong, it probably is. For the criminal justice system, the case demonstrated that convictions can be obtained even in murder cases without a body, but only when the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming and properly preserved and presented. This has implications for other cases where bodies haven't been recovered, providing prosecutors with a roadmap for how to build and present such cases to juries. The case also highlighted the importance of witness cooperation, even delayed cooperation. The breakthrough witness who came forward years after the crimes provided the crucial context that transformed scientific evidence into a coherent narrative. This reminds investigators that witnesses may need time to come forward, may need to see that law enforcement is still engaged, may need the reassurance of knowing their information will be protected and valued. Educational programs about child safety now sometimes reference the Arianna Fitts case as a tragic example of what can happen when systems fail to protect vulnerable children. Social work students, law enforcement cadets, and child care providers learn about this case as part of understanding their responsibilities and the real-world consequences when those responsibilities aren't met. The legacy of Arianna Fitts includes tangible changes in policy and practice, but also something less quantifiable but equally important: a collective determination that no child should be forgotten, that every missing child deserves tireless advocacy, and that cold cases should never be allowed to gather dust and fade away. Other cold cases in California and beyond have been reopened with renewed energy following the successful resolution of Arianna's case. Investigators applied similar techniques, DNA reanalysis, digital forensics, social media engagement, to cases that had been dormant for years. Some of these cases have begun yielding results, demonstrating that the template developed through the Arianna Fitts investigation has broader applicability. The case reminds us that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Nearly a decade passed between Arianna's disappearance and the conviction of the person responsible, but that conviction was still meaningful, still important, still necessary. Families waiting for answers about their own missing loved ones draw strength from knowing that even years later, breakthroughs remain possible. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Arianna Fitts case is the simplest and most profound. Every child matters, every victim deserves justice, and society has a collective responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. When that protection fails, when children are harmed by those who should care for them, the full weight of the justice system must be brought to bear, no matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult the path to truth may be. As we reach the end of Arianna Fitts' story, we're left with complex emotions and important reflections. This case solved represents both a triumph and a tragedy. Triumph in that justice was eventually served, tragedy in that a little girl's life was stolen before it really began, and her final resting place remains unknown. Arianna would be a teenager now if she had lived. She would be going to school, making friends, discovering who she wanted to become. She would be experiencing all the awkwardness and joy of adolescence. She would have dreams for her future. Instead, she exists as a memory, as photographs that capture her only as a toddler, as a name on missing children databases, and as a case that finally, after years of being cold, was solved. Her mother, Nicole Fitts, tried to protect her daughter even in the face of danger, and that courage ultimately cost Nicole her life. The family that loved both of them has endured years of not knowing, followed by the partial closure of a conviction without the complete closure of recovery. They continue to hope that someday, somehow, someone will provide the information that allows them to bring Arianna home. This case reminds us that cold cases are never truly hopeless. Technology continues to advance. Witnesses' circumstances and willingness to cooperate can change. Public awareness can generate new leads. The determination of investigators, families, and communities can sustain cases through years of apparent stagnation until finally, the breakthrough comes. For every case like Arianna's that eventually gets solved, there are countless others still waiting for their breakthrough. Every county, every state has missing persons, unsolved murders, families waiting for answers. These aren't just statistics or case numbers. They're real people, loved and missed, whose stories deserve to be told and whose cases deserve to remain active. If you have information about any unsolved case, about any missing person, remember that your tip could be the one that finally brings resolution. You might think what you know is minor or insignificant, but investigators are often looking for precisely those small details that seem unimportant to a casual observer but prove crucial when combined with other evidence. Don't assume someone else has already reported what you know. Don't worry that too much time has passed for your information to matter. Reach out to law enforcement, to tip lines, to organizations dedicated to missing persons. Your information could change a family's life. For families dealing with missing loved ones, the Arianna Fitts case offers a difficult but important message. Never stop fighting, never stop advocating, never let your loved one be forgotten. Maintain their presence on social media. Work with missing persons organizations. Keep in contact with law enforcement. Participate in true crime media coverage if you're comfortable with it. The sustained pressure, the continued visibility, the refusal to let cases fade into obscurity. These factors contributed to solving Arianna's case, and they may contribute to solving others as well. The Bay Area community will remember Arianna Fitts. They'll remember a little girl who deserved protection and safety but received neither. They'll remember her mother, Nicole, who fought for her daughter until the very end. They'll remember the nearly decade-long wait for justice and the relief when it finally came, tempered by the heartbreak of unanswered questions. But beyond remembering, this community and others affected by this case have committed to action, supporting organizations that help missing children and their families, advocating for policies that better protect vulnerable children, staying vigilant in their own communities, creating a culture where harm to children is met with swift action and where children's safety is prioritized above all else. As for Arianna herself, she exists now in memory and in legacy, in the photographs her family treasures, in the memorial fund established in her name, in the policy changes implemented because of her case, in the renewed determination to solve other cold cases, in every child who is protected because someone learned from her tragedy and acted to prevent similar ones. The case of Arianna Fitts stands as a testament to persistence, to the power of modern forensics combined with traditional detective work, and to the unwavering love of a family that refused to let their little girl be forgotten. It's a solved cold case that still holds an unsolved mystery. Where is Arianna? And it's a reminder that every missing person, every cold case, every unsolved mystery represents a family still waiting, still hoping, still deserving of answers. If you have any information about Arianna Fitts' location or about any unsolved case in your area, please reach out to law enforcement. You could be the voice that finally brings someone home. You could be the person who provides the final piece of a puzzle that investigators have been trying to solve for years. Your information matters. Your voice matters. Every tip, every piece of information, every willingness to come forward and speak truth matters. This has been the story of Arianna Fitts. A cold case solved, an arrest that shocked a community, a conviction that brought partial justice, and a continuing search for complete answers. It's a story about loss and love, about evil and justice, about despair and persistence. Most of all, it's a reminder that behind every case, there's a person who mattered, who was loved, who deserves to be remembered. Thank you for listening to this difficult story. Thank you for helping keep Arianna's memory alive by hearing her name and learning her case. And thank you for understanding that cold cases represent real people, real families, and real opportunities for justice, no matter how much time has passed. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and remember that justice, though sometimes delayed, is always worth pursuing. In memory of Arianna Fitts and Nicole Fitts, may we all commit to protecting the vulnerable, seeking truth, and never giving up on those who have been lost.